Hello everyone, my name is Gabriela Rosas and I am a senior psychology student here at Cal State LA. My thesis centers on examining the need for lesbian, gay, and bisexual representation in intimate partner violence research through a systematic literature review. To begin my presentation, I'd like to introduce the definition of intimate partner violence. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention defines intimate partner violence as physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological aggression, including coercive tactics by a current or former intimate partner. This definition encompasses both heterosexual and non-heterosexual couples. Yet historically, IPV was regarded as being a heterosexual issue. However, current research on IPV within LGBT populations, which are lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, find that IPV is not unique to solely heterosexual relationships. In fact, IPV in LGBT relationships had a prevalence rate that was twice as high as IPV in heterosexual relationships. IPV is seen to be prevalent in heterosexual and non-heterosexual relationships at a similar or higher rate. Research shows that a higher percentage of lesbian and bisexual women will experience IPV over the course of their lifetime. A higher percentage of bisexual men will experience IPV as compared to heterosexual men, and while gay men might hold a slightly lower IPV prevalence over their lifetime than heterosexual men, their IPV levels are still similar enough to take note of. With a clear existence of IPV in LGBT relationships, there is clearly a need for LGBT representation in IPV research. When there is a lack of said representation, the research will not take into account variables that are unique to the LGBT experience, thus making the research conducted less generalizable to LGBT populations. When LGBT are not represented in research, there is a creation of a theoretical framework centered solely on the heterosexual experience. These frameworks do not consider the impact that the threat of outing has on LGBT individuals. For instance, not all LGBT who are in LGBT relationships are public about their sexuality. When they are threatened with the possibility of being outed, they are in turn forced into silence and stuck in their abusive relationships. Therefore, the opportunities that could have been available to them, had they not faced this unique barrier, are unobtainable. LGBT individuals are also faced with the barrier of their fear of bringing further stigmatization to the LGBT community. They are also faced with the possibility of further reinforcing the gendered stereotype that gay men are masculine, or that lesbian women, on the other hand, are extremely masculine. Some members of the LGBT population have reported fearing further marginalization of the community to the point where they encourage IPV survivors to stay silent about their experience. My goal for this project is to review the existing literature on intimate partner violence in LGBT populations. The purpose of doing so is to review the LGBT experience reported in intimate partner violence research and search for possible common themes. To conduct this literature review, I use the databases Google Scholar, PsycInfo, and CSULA OneSearch search engine. I placed settings that produced articles published in English between the years 2000 and 2021. The articles also had to center on LGBT IPV. From the results, 38 articles were selected based on their title and a brief overview of their abstracts. Articles that focused on drug use, sexual assault, and the transgender community were excluded for the purposes of this study. Upon a full reading of the articles, 8 more were excluded for the lack of relation to my thesis topic. The articles were then annotated, coded, and sorted in accordance with the 11 subcategories. The subcategories used to create my introduction and literature review included gay population, lesbian population, bisexual population, LGBT population, threat of outing, and fear of further stigmatization. The subcategories used throughout my results section included shelters, police assistance, therapeutic care, medical care, minority stress, and sexual minority stress. Existing research shows support for the need of more inclusive shelters. Men generally report to be denied admission to women's shelters regardless of their circumstance, which includes needing IPV assistance. Therefore, men who are experiencing IPV have this resource completely unavailable to them. This is a major problem because IPV is not exclusive to women and exists in both heterosexual and homosexual relationships. In fact, with 29% of heterosexual men and 37% of gay men being projected to experience IPV over their lifetime. With the creation of shelters that focus on the experience of IPV beyond gender, a greater population of individuals seeking assistance can be met with proper resources. Another resource that needs attention is therapeutic care. In one study, about 50% of therapists interviewed reported having dealt with LGBT clientele sometimes or often within the year cycle, yet also reported having little to no training on how to address LGBT IPV. This limited clinician training on how to address LGBT IPV may be due to limited academia on non heterosexual IPV. Consequently, individuals who identify as LGBT also report receiving inadequate support from clinicians in cases where they do seek therapeutic care. This can be due to personal opinions held by therapists on homosexuality, which influences the treatment plans that they create for their LGBT clientele. For instance, clinicians have been found to perceive IPV in heterosexual couples as more severe than lesbian IPV, urging fewer lesbian IPV survivors to press charges as opposed to heterosexual female IPV survivors. To combat these false perceptions and biases regarding the LGBT community following and throughout their experience with IPV, therapists must be introduced to more research on IPV in the LGBT community. This research can only exist with adequate representation of LGBT populations in IPV research. When individuals experience IPV call law enforcement, they are doing so with the belief that help will arrive. However, when said individuals are LGBT, they are often met with a lack of support they would receive had they been heterosexual. When LGBT IPV survivors do reach out for law enforcement assistance, they often encounter officers who are less likely to intervene or arrest perpetrators in LGBT couplings and are less likely to recommend pressing charges against their abusers. These reactions could possibly be due to gender stereotype biases held by officers. Police officers are traditionally trained to deal with IPV based on male violence against women, resulting in a lack of preparedness to address LGBT IPV. They have reported having difficulty applying heterosexual gender models on dealing with IPV onto LGBT couples. One study provided an explanation for why certain officers hold a disbelief in the possibility of IPV in lesbian relationships, citing their subscription to gender stereotype that women are incapable of inducing harm. They have also reported that officers find woman-on-woman IPV to be amusing or brushed off as a catfight. Conversely, men who seek police assistance when dealing with IPV fall victim to the stereotype bias that men are unable to be victimized in relationships. For example, one study reported that officers generally leave homosexual IPV victims to fend for themselves based on their assessment that the violence is a fair fight. LGBT IPV survivors have also reported having their experiences taken down in a manner that discredits their cases, making their abuse seem less serious. IPV rates vary based on sexuality and ethnic identity, respectively, which calls for sensitivity to both sexual minority and ethnic minority experiences in future IPV research, otherwise known as taking an intersectional approach. Current research tends to focus on heterosexual, white middle-class individuals, failing to serve diverse communities. Such a biased approach leaves out the factor of ethnic identity, which has been shown to be linked to IPV levels. Current literature states that Asian American, African American, Latin American, and Native American populations have reported higher IPV prevalence rate in comparison to white Americans. With IPV prevalent in all types of cultures, there is an existing demand for greater culture sensitivity in IPV research. An intersectional approach would incorporate sexuality and ethnicity into research, which is a major necessity, considering the different experiences IPV survivors have based on their identity. For instance, lesbian and bisexual women report experiencing IPV at twice the rate than heterosexual women, which highlights the importance of sensitivity to sexuality in research. With the incorporation of ethnicity, researchers then find that lesbian and bisexual women who identify as an ethnic minority experience even higher rates of IPV than both lesbian and bisexual white women. This showcases one example of the necessity of an intersectional approach that is sensitive to both sexuality and ethnicity. When resources are created with diverse communities in mind, they can create programs suited to help individuals who subscribe to different cultural influences and norms. In conclusion, upon examining the existing literature on LGB-IPV, 4 main points were called to attention regarding the LGB experience. The results center on 3 sources of inadequate assistance LGB survivors are met with, including shelters, law enforcement, and therapeutic care. Due to a lack of adequate help from the listed resources, LGB appear to have limited optimization of care, which potentially impacts the acceptability and quality of interventions and healthcare within this population. The results also demonstrate a need for an intersectional approach on future IPV research, considering the unique experiences IPV survivors endure based on their respective identity. The results imply that due to a lack of sufficient inclusivity in IPV research, resources such as shelter, law enforcement, and medical care are created and operated with a heterosexual bias. This implies that for the creation of LGBT-friendly resources to be possible, LGBT IPV must be included in future IPV research. The results also demonstrate a need for an intersectional approach on future IPV research that is sensitive to both sexuality and ethnicity, considering the unique experiences IPV survivors endure based on their respective identity. As earlier noted, LGBT who identify as an ethnic minority are held at an even higher risk of IPV, bringing forth the need for an intersectional approach. The previous studies examined in the systematic literature review provided examples of LGBT experiences with IPV and resources and assistance they received. Future research should investigate what impact, if any, an inclusive IPV program can have on LGBT IPV survivors. A study like this would examine the role that inclusive resources and programs for IPV survivors plays on the prevalence of IPV survivors in the LGBT community. In theory, a lower prevalence of IPV amongst LGBT individuals and higher satisfaction regarding their experience in seeking resources should provide substantial evidence of the positive impact LGBT inclusion in IPV research can reap. Another possible study for future researchers should investigate whether there is a link between IPV and mental health outcomes such as major depressive symptoms or suicidal rates that vary between heterosexual and non-heterosexual survivors of IPV. Research already notes that there is an association between mental health and IPV, with mental. Oh my god. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Another possible study for future researchers should investigate whether there is a link between IPV and mental health outcomes, such as major depressive symptoms or suicide rates, that vary between heterosexual and non heterosexual survivors of IPV. Research already notes that there is an association between mental health and IPV, with sexual minorities having poorer mental health than heterosexual individuals facing IPV. Other existing research presents support for a link between teen dating violence and increased suicidality among sexual minority youth. And finally, a study centered on violent deaths in Kentucky found that intimate partner violence, a subcategory of IPV, was found in a quarter of suicides. So, based on the existing knowledge, the next step would be to expand the population to the general LGBT population in search of a possible correlation between LGBT IPV survivors and suicide rate differences in comparison to heterosexual IPV survivors. I would like to take this moment to express my gratitude towards my advisor, Dr. Camacho Thompson, Ms. Rodriguez, the Cal State LA staff, and everyone from the Honors College. Thank you for this opportunity. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time. This is never going to be so mad. Are you kidding me? I wasn't even recording. Return to meeting. Yeah, I was. There it is.